Reference Associate Sammie, and this is episode 3 of Chapters. This week, we'll be reading another chapter from an Arthur Conan Doyle novel, but then this time we'll be transported deep into the forests of the Amazon in his novel, Lost World. As you can see, I am a huge dinosaur nerd, which is why I chose this book. And this time we'll be reading chapter 10, which means I need to catch you up a little bit. We'll be following Malone, a young reporter, as he goes on a dangerous expedition with Professor Challenger and Professor Summerlee alongside Lord Roxton. With the help of two natives, Gomez and Zambo, they come across a plateau that shows signs of primitive life. It's hard to get to, but they find a ravine, cut down a tree, and crawl across. But Gomez pushes the tree into the ravine just after the main team gets across, stranding them on the plateau, and Gomez and Zambo on the other side. And that is when we get to chapter 10, and now we will begin.
It was destined that on this very morning, our first morning in the new country, we were to find out what strange hazard lay around us. It was a loathsome adventure, and one which I hate to think. If, as Lord John said, the glade of the iguanodons will remain with us as a dream, then surely the swamp of the pterodactyls will forever be our nightmare. Let me set down exactly what occurred. We passed very slowly through the woods, partly because Lord Roxton acted as scout before he would let us advance, and partly because every second step one or another of our professors would fall with a cry of wonder before some flower or insect which presented him with a new type. We may have traveled 2 or 3 miles in all, keeping to the right of the line of the stream, when we came upon a considerable opening in the trees. A belt of brushwood led up to a tangle of rocks. The whole plateau was strewn with boulders. We were walking slowly towards these rocks, among bushes which reached over our waists, when we became aware of a strange, low gabbling and whistling sound, which filled the air with a constant clamor, and appeared to come from a spot immediately before us. Lord John held up his hand as a signal for us to stop, and he made his way swiftly, stooping and running, to the line of rocks. We saw him peep over them and give a gesture of amazement. Then he stood, staring, as if forgetting us, so utterly entranced was he by what he saw. Finally, he waved us to come on, holding up his hand as a signal for caution. His whole bearing made me feel that something wonderful but dangerous lay before us. Creeping to his side, we looked over the rocks. The place into which we gazed was a pit, and may, into the early days, have been one of the smaller volcanic blowholes of the plateau. It was bowl-shaped, and at the bottom, some hundreds of yards from where we lay, were pools of green-scummed, stagnant water fringed with bulrushes. It was a weird place in itself, but its occupants made it seem like a scene from the 7 Circles of Dante. The place was a rookery of pterodactyls. There were hundreds of them congregated within view. All the bottom area round the water edge was alive with their young ones, and with hideous mothers brooding upon their leathery yellowish eggs. From this crawling, flapping mass of obscene reptilian life came the shocking clamor which filled the air, and the mephitic, horrible, musty odor which turned us sick. But above, perched each into its own stone, tall, gray, and withered, more like dead and dried specimen than actual living creatures, sat the horrible males, absolutely motionless, save the rolling of their red eyes or occasional snap of their rat-trap beaks as a dragonfly went past them. Their huge membranous wings were closed by folding their forearms so that they sat like gigantic old women, wrapped in a hideous web-colored shawls, and with their ferocious heads protruding above them. Large and small, not less than 1,000 of these filthy creatures lay in the hollow before us. Our professors would gladly have stayed there all day, so entranced were they by this opportunity of studying the life of a prehistoric age. They pointed out the fish and dead birds laying about among the rocks as proving the nature of the food of these creatures, and I heard them congratulating each other on having cleared up the point why the bones of these flying dragons are found in such great numbers in certain well-defined areas, as in the Cambridge green sands, since it is now seen that, like penguins, they live in gregarious fashion. Finally, however, Challenger, bent upon proving some point which Summerlee had contested, thrust his head over the rock and nearly brought destruction upon us all. In an instant the nearest male gave a shrill whistling cry, and flapped its 20-foot span of leathery wings as it soared up into the air. The females and young ones huddled together beside the water, while the whole circle of sentinels rose one after the other and sailed off into the sky. It was a wonderful sight to see at least 100 creatures of such enormous size and hideous appearance, all swooping like swallows with swift, shearing wing strokes above us. But soon we realized that it was not one on which we could afford to linger. At first the great brutes flew round in a huge ring, as if to make sure that when the exact extent of danger might be. Then the flight grew lower and the circle narrower, until they were whizzing round us and round us, the dry, rustling flap of their huge slate-colored wings filling the air with a volume of sound that made me think of Hendon Aerodrome upon a race day. "Make for the wood, and keep together!" cried Lord John, clubbing his rifle. "The brutes mean mischief!" The moment we attempted to retreat, the circle closed in upon us, until the tips of the wings of those nearest to us nearly touched our faces. We beat at them with the stocks of our guns, but there was nothing solid or vulnerable to strike. Then suddenly, out of the whizzing, slate-colored circle, a long neck shot out, and a fierce beak made a thrust at us. Another and another followed. Summerlee gave a cry, and put his hand to his face, from which the blood was streaming. I felt a prod at the back of my neck, and turned dizzy with shock. Challenger fell, and as I stood to pick him up I was again struck from behind, and dropped on top of him. At the same instant I heard the crash of Lord John's elephant gun, and, looking up, saw one of the creatures with a broken wing struggling upon the ground, spitting and gurgling at us with a wide-open beak and bloodshot, goggled eyes, like some devil in a medieval picture. Its comrades had flown higher at the sudden sound, and were circling above our heads. "Now!" cried Lord John. "Now for our lives!" We staggered through the brushwood, and even as we reached the trees, the harpies were on us again. Summerlee was knocked down, but we tore him up and rushed among the trunks. Once there we were safe, for those huge wings had no space for their sweep beneath the branches. As we limped homewards, sadly mauled and discomfited, we saw them for a long time flying at a great height against the deep blue sky above our heads, soaring round and round, no bigger than wood-pigeons, with their eyes no doubt still following our progress. At last, however, we reached the thicker woods. They gave up the chase, and we saw them no more. "A most interesting and convincing experience," said Challenger, as we halted beside the brook, and he bathed a swollen knee. "We are exceptionally well informed, Summerlee, as to the habits of the enraged pterodactyl." Summerlee was wiping the blood from a cut in his forehead, while I was tying up a nasty stab in the muscle of the neck. Lord John had the shoulder of his coat torn away, but the creature's teeth had only grazed the flesh. "It is worth noting," Challenger continued, "that our young friend has received an undoubted stab, while Lord John's coat has only been torn by a bite. In my own case, I was beaten over the head by their wings, so we have a remarkable exhibition of their various methods of offence. "It has been touch and go for our lives," said Lord John gravely, "and I could not think of a more rotten sort of death than to be outed by such filthy vermin. I was sorry to fire my rifle, but by Jove, there was no great choice." "We should not be here if you hadn't," said I, with conviction. "It may do no harm," said he. "Among these woods there may be many loud cracks from splitting or falling trees, which would be just like the sound of a gun. But now, if you are of my opinion, we have had thrills enough for one day, and had best get back to the surgical box at the camp for some carbolic. Who knows what venom these beasts may have had in their hideous jaws? But surely no men have ever had such a day since the world began. Some fresh surprise was ever in store for us. When following the course of our brook, we at last reached our glade, and saw the thorny barricade of our camp. We thought that our adventures were at last at end. But we had something more to think of before we could rest. The gate of Fort Challenger had been untouched, the walls were unbroken, and yet it had been visited by some strange and powerful creature in our absence. No footmark showed a trace of its nature, and only the overhanging branch of an enormous ginkgo tree suggested how it might have come and gone. But of its most malevolent strength there was an ample evidence in the condition of our stores. They were strewn at random all over the ground, and one tin of meat had been crushed into pieces so as to extract the contents. A case of cartridges had been shattered into matchwood, and one of the brass shells lay shredded into pieces beside it. Again the feeling of vague horror came upon our souls, and we gazed round with frightened eyes at the dark shadows which lay around us, in all of which some fearsome shape might be lurking. How good it was we were hailed by the voice of Zambo, and going to the edge of the plateau, we saw him grinning at us upon the top of the opposite pinnacle. "All well, Mr. Challenger, all well," he said. "Me stay here, no fear. You always find me when you want." His honest black face, and the immense view upon us, which carried us half-way to the affluent of the Amazon, helped us to remember that we were upon the earth in the 20th century, and had not, by some magic, been conveyed to the raw planet in its earliest and wildest state. How difficult it was to realize that the violet line upon the far horizon was well advanced to the great river upon which huge steamers ran, and folk talked about the small affairs of life, while we, marooned among the great creatures of a bygone age, could but gaze towards it and yearned for all that it meant.
I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. Make sure to come back in 2 weeks for episode 4 of Chapters.